He's the voice that's dominated the general election campaign so far. And once again, here we have Nigel Farage, this time attacking Boris Johnson.
Perhaps it's Boris Johnson that's morally repugnant and not me, I don't know. But can you see the sheer level of hypocrisy? Can you see the nonsense of all of this? And let's be clear, this man will go down as the worst Prime Minister of modern times, a man who betrayed an 80-seat majority. Who opened the door to mass immigration? Boris Johnson. Who betrayed the will of Brexit voters? It was Boris Johnson. He pretended to be a Conservative, but he governed as a Green. He put in place net zero.
It's a very special Daily Tea today because in Kamal Ahmed's absence, we have another Telegraph star in the studio, Gordon Rayner, who is joining me, the Associate Editor, the man who writes all the big stories and scoops for this newspaper. You're saying nothing, Gordon.
I'm not going to confirm or deny whether that's true, Camilla.
So, as well as discussing Nigel Farage, Gordon and I will be talking about Gambling Gate and whether it's on a par with Partygate in terms of Tory blunders during this election campaign, of which there have been many.
Yep, and we'll be asking if Kemi Badenoch has got what it takes to unite the right after we profiled her in the Telegraph this weekend.
So welcome to a very special Daily Tea with me, Camilla.
And me, Gordon Rayner.
Gordon, before we get into Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson and that row about Putin, can we discuss Taylor Swift? Because somebody's told me that you were offered the opportunity to see Taylor Swift and her Eras tour at Wembley last night.
I was.
And you turned down the ticket.
I did.
Why?
Well, how can I put this without being cancelled? I'm not really a fan of Taylor Swift.
Oh, my good. I don't know if we can allow that kind of language in the Daily Tea studio.
We might need to edit that bit out, otherwise I'm going to get trolled. No, but I think the more important thing about last night was that so my wife and my daughter went. It was my daughter's second Taylor Swift concert of the week. After she went in Cardiff as well.
She's a real Swiftie then.
She's an OG Swiftie.
What does OG mean?
I don't actually know. It means original generation or something like that.
Oh, does it? Like
yes.
An Uber Swiftie?
It means that you were there at the beginning.
Oh, I see. All right, good.
So, she's in her late 20s. I should point out this isn't a 14-year-old.
No.
Although there's a great similarity in her behaviour when she goes to Taylor Swift concerts. So she went to Cardiff on Tuesday. It all went fine and no problems with transport, etc. Then last night she went to Wembley, where Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, had made great play of how everything was set up. He tweeted, "London, we are ready."
Yes.
We saw that Taylor's version of the tube map that was put out with Mayor of London stamped all over it.
Yeah.
And then guess what? When they left the concert last night, they could not get on the tube for love nor money. They queued for about an hour and a half. When they eventually got onto the tube platform, it took half an hour for a tube to arrive.
My God.
It was an absolute shambles. And so everybody had been in mega Swiftie heaven, and then all of a sudden they were in Sadiq Khan hell when they went to get
and
the tube.
what time did they get back?
About 2 a.m. So I'm afraid Sadiq Khan may have lost the Swifties, which is a very dangerous position to be in.
But that you won't be counted among them because you were never one of them.
No, no, they never had me in the first place.
And you're probably rubbing your hands together with glee at the fact that you got an early night and they had a traffic nightmare. So that you reap what you sow if you're a Swiftie. This is the thing.
In fairness, I'm not sure 50-something men are the core Swift.
Hang on a moment. We had the Prince of Wales dad dancing in a box at Wembley. Did you find slightly embarrassing? Slightly cringe?
Well, I don't. I'm always worried that people do that for show a little bit. He is younger than me.
If he was doing it for show, he could have danced a bit better. Did he know he was being filmed? I mean, he was throwing some serious shapes.
Well, he has to assume he's being filmed at all times, surely, doesn't he?
He does do. Well, there we have it. Gordon is not a Swiftie, but he is a daily tear, and that's what we need, because we're going to be discussing, and I'm so glad you're in the studio to discuss this whole row now between Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, because you know both of them pretty well, particularly Nigel Farage, and we'll get onto this in a moment because you've covered all of the banking scandal with him and his cancellation by Coutts, and I know you're in touch with him during the campaign, as you would be all of the main political parties. But he's taken to the stage today to rebut this suggestion that he is in any way a Putin sympathiser after his comments last week. And before we get to his comments last week, to refresh the memory, we've now got this row going on, this blue-on-blue row between Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, because Johnson's come out and said that he's guilty of sort of peddling Kremlin propaganda. And this was all after the Reform leader argued that the West had provoked the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So let's just go back to the original comments he made to Nick Robinson in that BBC interview. It was on Panorama last week, just so we can clarify exactly what he did say originally.
When Vladimir Putin sent his troops across the border in 22, you blamed the West, not him. You said, I'll just read it to you and then you can react, that on a tweet, it was a consequence of EU and NATO expansion. Is that a judgment you stand by?
Right. I'll tell you what you don't know. I stood up in the European Parliament in 2014 and I said, and I quote, there will be a war in Ukraine. Why did I say that? It was obvious to me that the ever eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union was giving this man a reason to his Russian people to say they're coming for us again and to go to war.
But you were echoing him.
I was, sorry.
You were echoing him. That's what Putin says.
No. Sorry, I've been saying this actually since the 1990s. Ever since the fall of the wall. But hang on a second. We've provoked this war. It's, of course it's his fault. He's used what we've done as an
provoked
excuse.
the invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, and very interestingly, once again, 10 years ago when I predicted this, by the way, I'm the only person in British politics that predicted what would happen. And of course, everyone said I was a pariah for daring to suggest it. George Robertson, former Labour cabinet minister, who went on to become the Secretary General of NATO, has in the last couple of weeks said the war is a direct result of EU expansionism.
Okay, so that's what he said last week. He kept referring in that clip to what he'd said to the EU Parliament in 2014. So let's listen to that.
Just to make that worse, of course, some NATO members said they too would like the Ukraine to join NATO. We directly encouraged the uprising in the Ukraine that led to the toppling of the President Yanukovych, and that led, of course, in turn to Vladimir Putin reacting. And the moral of the story is if you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised when he reacts. Now, just to continue with that, today we are rushing through an association agreement at undue speed with the Ukraine, and as we speak, there are NATO soldiers engaged in military exercises in the Ukraine. Have we taken leave of our senses? Do we actually want to have a war with Putin? Because if we do, we're certainly going about it the right way.
Right, so where we're at is he's obviously doubling down on what he had said to Nick Robinson, which is interesting, Gordon, because often if politicians are caught out and there's criticism of what they say, they normally distance themselves and say, well, hang on, can I just please clarify?
Yeah, Keir Starmer not wanting to say he thought Jeremy Corbyn would have been a great Prime Minister.
Exactly, whereas with Farage you have this kind of like absolutely resolute, well, I believe what I believe. So he doubled down in the Telegraph at the weekend on Saturday. He's then given an interview to the Mail on Sunday, again doubling down. Now he's entered into this row directly with Johnson because the former Prime Minister is basically saying you're a Kremlin apologist. He's come back at him on X, formerly known as Twitter, saying, Boris, you are a liar and a hypocrite. I am glad you are no longer Prime Minister of this country, which it seems to me now we know what we know, Gordon, was to preface what he's now gone and done in a news conference, which we heard at the beginning of the show, is he's saying Boris is a hypocrite because?
Yeah, so I was sent a picture by somebody who is at that event today. He's standing on a podium in front of an enormous blow-up picture of a front page of the I newspaper. with a headline in this eye is Boris blames EU for war in Ukraine. I think that's a copy of that newspaper from 2016. So this is why he's referring to Boris as a hypocrite. And it's interesting because I think you have to, as you just said, you have to give him some credit for the fact that he is sticking to his guns, that he's not trying to backtrack and pretend that he didn't say it in the first place. I don't think it's good politics. I think that telling people that you predicted something awful was going to happen doesn't necessarily win you any friends. Normally he's in tune with a significant chunk of the electorate, but anything that can be construed as being pro-Putin is not going to win you any support.
It's really weird, this, because I spoke to Kwasi Kwarteng about this yesterday, and he was saying this just sounds cranky. I get the whole, I'm very honest, I'm upfront, I'm going to just say what I believe and I'm not going to shy away from it. And that really appeals to his kind of what I would call reform fanboys and girls, the people on X who are vociferously supporting his positioning. But at the same time, that's not good enough, is it? If he wants reform to be above that average poll rate of, I think it's 17% at the moment, he's got to be appealing to moderate Tories. I don't know about you, but I've spoken to a number of moderate Tories, and this actually came up in the leader meeting earlier, where a number of our colleagues were saying, yeah, I've had a few people contact me to say, I was going to support reform, and now he said this, I'm not going to, because this is not aligned with my thinking. I'm a Thatcherite. I support sort of Reagan on foreign policy. I support the Boris approach to Ukraine, which has been pretty robust, let's be honest.
Yep.
People say that was like one of the highlights of his premiership. This is a complete departure from this sense of fairness. It's really nuanced, though, Gordon. I mean, he does have a point, but it's weird that he's decided to be an outlier on this, because it's not winning him any favours.
No. I think the point he is making about the idea of if you poke the bear, I think the whole argument about whether by potentially expanding NATO right to the doorstep of Russia, was that a clever idea? That's all arguable. There's a perfectly good argument on both sides. But I don't think you're going to find many people out there who are going to decide that they want to vote reform because Farage has said either that we provoked the war in Ukraine, or that we're still. I mean, he has said in the past that he has certain grudging admiration for Putin for certain.
Did he mention
things.
once? He was asked, "Who do you most admire?" And he said Putin.
He's obviously. Explained what he meant by that, and he's said that the invasion of Ukraine was immoral and indefensible. Look, what he's trying to say is Putin is a very adept politician, and he has been able to get his country behind him. And we know that, for example, people in Russia don't have the same attitude towards the war in Ukraine that people in the West have. A lot of them are very supportive of it, but again, you don't get any gold stars for saying that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's like Hitler was a good orator.
Yeah.
That might be true, but are you going to be saying that on a campaign trail?
No. So I don't think that. I don't think he's got this right. I think he's a very. We were talking, weren't we, about no publicity is bad publicity. I don't think that always holds sway. And I think that the fact that he's allowed himself to be dragged into talking about this a lot is just not good politics. I think that he could have nuanced what he is saying. He could have said, "Yeah, I did say that, and what I meant by that was this," and he could have softened it, and he could have sort of tried to just make it go away, and maybe started talking about some other big issue that might have distracted people. That would be the classic thing to do, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, also, is this a big issue for people in the Red Wall? I mean, is this generally
I don't suppose
at the
they're
top
Putin
of people?
supporters. So, yeah.
I mean, also, what I find interesting about the dialogue around this, having covered it yesterday on GB News, and I interviewed Ben Habib, who is the deputy leader of Reform, about this, and I was being quite critical because I think he has, dropped a kahune, so to speak. And then I got a load of backlash on social media. How dare you? So there are all of these, what I would call sort of the Faragean thought police, who are arguing that if you don't agree with Nigel, then you're wrong, and saying that you're then a victim of a media conspiracy. First of all, that's thoroughly Trumpian, and maybe that's what he's trying to achieve. But it's very anti-Farage. It's very anti the Farage approach, which is everyone's entitled to their opinion. You should be listened to. You can't say anything that will make you cancelled. Like, there's now this narrative that is trying to shut down dissent and criticism of the person that never wants to shut down dissent and criticism because he believes in free speech.
Yeah. And look, I mean, you were saying that I've spent a lot of time talking to Farage and spent a lot of time with him. The thing that always strikes me whenever I spend time with him when he's out in public is that, milkshakes aside, he has that Boris factor that people want to come up and talk to him. They want to shake his hand. They want to have selfies with him. I've never, like I say, milkshake aside, because I've never spent any time with him where anyone has approached him in a negative or aggressive way. It's always people who want to say, "Oh, we think you're great," and that's because he has that common touch. Politics now is so much about personalities, and we'll probably talk about this a bit more when we talk about Kemi Badenoch later. That the reason that he's been so successful, and also the reason that people say Reform is a one-man party, is that he is someone that people can imagine going down to the pub with and having a pint with, right? Like Boris, exactly like Boris. And the opposite of Rishi Sunak, who people can't imagine going down the pub with, and probably Keir Starmer. And in fairness, what you see is what you get. When you spend time with him, that is what he's like. You know that. And he's very good company. He's very good fun. And he does it all with a smile on his face. And people respond to that.
Yeah.
But it just feels like a real misstep.
But is he, as former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace described him in the Telegraph over the weekend, just a pub bore? Is he that bloke who sits in the corner opining the state of things with a pint in his hand, going, "Oh, if I was running the country, I'd do this, this and this"? The one thing about the campaign, in some respects, it's been great for him. All he wants is to be talked about the whole time. You say about the selfie factor, I completely agree with that. The guy's got an ego as well, by the way. He can be quite thin-skinned if criticised. I'll just say that, but all politicians are.
I'm not going to deny that.
Don't deny that. But is there also, Kamal would argue this, is this campaign revealing the lack of seriousness at the heart of him? He's somebody that is great with sound bites, but when you actually drill into the substance, there's not much there.
Well, to answer your first question, I would say no, he's not a pub bore. I think he likes having a debate, as you said before. He is someone who believes very much that other people should be entitled to their opinions, and if you don't agree with it, then you talk to them about it and you don't shout them down. I think also you were talking about the idea of people sort of being insulting on social media if you disagree with what he says. I think there's a problem there that you can't control who your supporters are, So I don't think he lacks seriousness. After all, we're talking about probably the most successful politician this country's produced in decades.
Yes.
The biggest thing that's happened in this country in decades is Brexit. That would not have happened without Nigel Farage. There's just no two ways about that.
His communication skills are second to none.
Yeah, and he believes passionately in what he believes in.
Yeah.
I think the problem, perhaps, if you're sort of talking about somebody who says he wants to be Prime Minister in the next election but one, is, well, how deep does his engagement with other parts of policy go? Does he really have well worked out policies on the NHS, on defence, on education, on tax, on welfare, all those things?
Gordon, let's gauge some reader reaction, because our readers do like Nigel Farage, and they are torn, aren't they, often between voting for the Tories and Reform.
Yeah, and they would like him to be the Tory leader, a lot of them.
Indeed they would. We'll talk about another Tory leader that could be a contender in a moment, Kemi Badenoch. But let's just have a look at this. So this is an example of somebody sort of saying that they've been put off by this whole intervention. Sir, I was considering voting reform, not now. Ukraine is an independent sovereign country existing within internationally recognised borders. Its application to join NATO was largely the result of its discovery in 2014 that bullies do not recognise neutrality. And that's from Alistair Macmillan in Port Glasgow, Renfrewshire.
Yeah, and then we have a letter from a rather different side of the spectrum. Sir, Nigel Farage's explanation, not justification, for Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine is an uncomfortable truth that other leaders are too quick to dismiss. As Russia's empire disintegrated, it was given the clear impression that there would be no NATO expansion towards its borders, not least in the assurance offered to Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990 by the US Secretary of State James Baker, quote, not 1 inch. Despite this, 3 former members of the USSR and all of its former Warsaw Pact satellite states joined NATO. Little consideration was given to the long-term implications of this huge geopolitical shift. And that's from Rear Admiral Philip Matthias, retired.
I love the fact that we get retired admirals writing into the Telegraph. Just out of interest, YouGov in May found that 8 in 10 Britons would be in favour of Ukraine's accession to NATO, while just 6% would oppose it. And you won't be surprised to learn, Gordon, this was the most commented on story on the website over the weekend. So the original news piece on Farage gathered over 6,600 comments. And then Richard Kemp, Colonel Richard Kemp's piece criticising Farage gathered a further 6,800 comments. So it's one of those stories that will run and run.
Well, yeah, like him or loathe him, you can't ignore him.
You can't indeed. Right, coming up next, we're going to discuss the gambling scandal that has derailed the Tories' election campaign. Well, it's a story that won't go away for the Tories, the investigation into bets placed on a July election on the day before it was announced by Rishi Sunak. It's now 11 days since news broke that Craig Williams, Mr Sunak's parliamentary private secretary, admitted that he had had a flutter on a July election, prompting an investigation by the Gambling Commission. And Gordon, there's an update on this story.
So Rishi Sunak has today confirmed that Conservative HQ has launched an internal inquiry into the gambling scandal, as well as the Gambling Commission looking into it.
So that's a development, isn't it? Because we had one investigation. The Prime Minister, clearly under pressure, is thinking that they should look at it themselves.
Yep.
It should be specified, though, Gordon. We're talking about all this. These are only allegations. Nobody's been found guilty of anything.
Yep.
Nobody's admitted any guilt. So we must caveat this conversation in those terms.
Yeah.
Having said that, when we talk about election cut-through, this is cut-through because we've got a YouGov poll. You spotted this. This is fascinating, isn't it? It's found that people have heard of the gambling investigation. That's a story that people had noticed the most in the news. And there was some statistic to suggest that more people had heard about the gambling scandal than had actually heard about the general election campaign in itself, which is slightly scary.
Yeah.
And, of course, it's being weaponised by Labour, Gordon.
Yeah, so Jonathan Ashworth, who people will know as Labour's main attack dog, they'll certainly know his voice, even if they, don't know him very well. He rather mischievously reported rumours of a cabinet minister being among those under investigation.
No evidence of that, by the way.
No evidence of that. And of course, he said that knowing entirely what he was doing, because he knew that if he put that out there, that would get reported. He knew that by reporting it, the Prime Minister would then get asked about it, and therefore we end up with Rishi Sunak having to talk about whether or not a cabinet minister is involved. It's
the politics of an election campaign. Yeah. It's deep, it's down, it's dirty, it's in the mud. This is the Prime Minister addressing the issue on the BBC Question Time special when he's asked by a member of the audience about the scandal and is then asked to clarify further by Fiona Bruce.
Aren't these emerging allegations about betting on the election date the absolute epitome of the lack of ethics that we have had to tolerate from the Conservative Party for years and years?
Just to be clear, for those of you who might not have kept up with it, 3 people are being investigated by the Gambling Commission about placing a bet on the timing of the election. 2 are Conservative Party candidates, Craig Williams, Laura Saunders, and her husband, Tony Lee, is the Conservative Party Director of Campaigning. They are being investigated. There's also an issue with a police officer who's been arrested. But these are three people connected to the Conservative Party.
Yeah. Well, like you, I was incredibly angry to learn of these allegations. It's a really serious matter. It's right that they're being investigated properly by the relevant law enforcement authorities, including, as Fiona said, a criminal investigation by the police. You know, I want to be crystal clear that if anyone has broken the rules, they should face the full force of the law, and that's what those investigations are there to do, and I hope that they do their work as quickly and as thoroughly as possible.
OK, clearly Rishi Sunak sounds angry. I mean, that's the angriest he's sounded during the campaign, despite everything that's happened. I would be angry if I was reading the Sunday Times and I read that Michael Gove, of all people, as he runs off from his Surrey Heath seat into the distance, likening it to partygate. I mean, that might be true, but how does that help Rishi Sunak?
Yeah, I'm not sure Michael Gove is going to be invited to be their person in the spin room from now on. I thought... So the ironic thing is that when you listen to that clip, I thought that it was one of the better moments of the campaign for Sunak, because he showed a bit of steel. He did sound angry. It also reminded me a bit of when you interviewed him in the hustings event, in the leadership hustings, when he was talking about his parents sending him to private school. Yeah,
that got his back up.
Yeah, and he was, he did that whole, you think I'm going to apologise for my parents making sacrifices, for me, you've got another thing coming, sort of thing. And that, that was him being passionate. That's when he's at his best, I think, when he's, when he does get his back up a little bit. So in one respect, it was quite a good moment for him. But the problem is that it does feel as though the public, has latched onto it, as we know from those polling numbers you were talking about. And the public does seem to be starting to sort of think of this a little bit in the same way as Partygate, which doesn't help that Michael Gove is pointing them in that direction. And it's not going to decide the outcome of the election, but it could cost the Tories votes. And if it costs Tories votes, it could cost them seats. I think it's symbolic of the way that nothing's going right in this election for the Tories. They just can't buy a sort of day of good news. And I think the big problem for Sunak in all of this is that he's been trying to present himself in the election campaign as the person who is the break from the last 14 years of Tory rule. He's that slightly odd idea of him being a change candidate. He's trying to tell people, I'm not Boris Johnson, I'm not Liz Truss. Yeah. You can trust me. But if, as the questioner in that Question Time clip sort of intimated, if the public are seeing this as being his version of Partygate, then that means that they're going to see him exactly as being just like, the last 14 years. And that's really a problem for them, I think. You're
constantly in contact with Conservative Party campaign headquarters, right?
Yeah.
So what are the Tory bods saying about this? I mean, what are they saying generally, Gordon? When you phone them, are they like, hi, everything's going well?
Look, I think there's a certain air of resignation among them. I don't suppose I'm going to get into trouble for saying that. I think that look, there are still people there that are still fighting, and all credit to them. But on this specific point, they're really quite angry about it, because one of the ways that this story was developing at the end of last week was this idea that there was this huge spike in bets on the 21st, I think it was, certainly the day before he called the election. And we even did a graph of, bets on the early election, and it was nothing, then this huge spike. And a lot was in Tory HQ are convinced that spike was caused by journalists betting on an early election, because, there was a certain amount of sort of rumour going around the day before he called it. Lord Finkelstein, I think, talked about, there's a theory that he might do it. Yeah. There was talk in here, in our newsroom about it.
We were having arguments about whether he would be that foolish.
Exactly. I mean, I think the feeling here the day before was there's no way he'd do that. And then he did. But
the editor always thought he might do it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's quite possible that a lot of the people driving that spike were journalists or friends of journalists. And so they
They think we're being hypocrites.
Well, they feel that we're writing about a story that's kind of our fault in the first place. Who knows? They might be right. I'm sure there is some of that.
Surely not. I expect much better of journalists, Gordon.
It wasn't me.
Shall we talk about Kemi Badenoch? You think it's Badenoch. I think it's Badenoch.
I think that we will need to ask her if you have her on.
Do you know what? Excuse me. I did ask her this before I had to interview her. I'm just going to find it. Bear with me, please. Keep talking.
Did you record her telling you how to say her name?
No, but I wanted to know how to pronounce it on the telly.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just finding the message now. Yeah, she said it's Badenoch. It's Scottish.
How did she spell it out?
She spelt it Bade-Nock.
Bade what? How she spelled Bade?
B-A-D-E.
Yes.
Dash
that could still be
knock.
bad there. Not, couldn't it?
No, because then she would do bad-e-knock.
Right.
Can we just accept I'm right and you're wrong on this?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. But we think it's Scottish because her husband's called Hamish. And your father spotted that it was Scottish, because I hadn't realised this.
Yes, he immediately said, oh, she must be married to somebody who's Scottish.
And she has got Och in her name, so what are we thinking?
Yes.
She's secretly tartan clad. But the point is, why we're talking about her, Gordon, I mean, why wouldn't we? But isn't it funny how, as the Conservative Party collapses, the Telegraph comes out with this astonishing sort of MRP poll with Savanta predicting Tory-geddon. We know that they're going to be destroyed. We're now managing expectations. We've got Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, talking about supermajorities because they just don't think they can win deep down, even though Rishi Sunak's talking a good game about pulling off an unexpected victory. I mean, it would be quite the miracle.
Yeah.
But when we look through that polling, it was easier to tell who stayed than who went, because all the big beasts are blown to pieces.
Yeah.
And the one person out of all of the main leadership candidates that survives this election is Kemi Badenoch.
Yep. Her and, look, Tom Tugendhat also was predicted to survive. He's not as senior. I mean, she's a full cabinet minister. He's just a minister of state. And if, let's say that poll proved to be true, and it happened, then I guess we'd be looking at a Badenoch versus Tugendhat leadership.
Yes.
Runoff, probably. Maybe one or two other people might.
Yeah, because we're saying that Penny Mordaunt is in danger in Portsmouth, and therefore
she's definitely in danger.
She's in danger.
It doesn't need to be our sort of Tory wipeout poll for her to lose us.
But she's as popular. Well, let's put it this way: we've had a reader poll in the Telegraph online, haven't we? And I think it attracted about 42,000 votes, which is good.
Yep.
Kemi Badenoch comes out on top with 37% of the votes, and in second place is Penny Mordaunt on 27%.
Mm-hmm.
Boris Johnson comes third on 20%. I'm just going to put that out there.
Yep.
The Cincinnatus comeback is still on.
Mm-hmm.
But you made the point earlier that if you ask nationally who's more popular...
It's Penny. And Kemi only comes sixth now.
Oh!
That might be people gaming the polls, but...
Isn't it, maybe it's recognisability and the fact that everyone remembers Mordaunt from the coronation, and some people still don't know who Badenoch is.
Yeah, and I think, there's 2 points out of that. One is that the Tories, if they, let's assume, they lose the election and have to choose a new leader, which is... that may well happen.
Might happen. Should we put a bet on it?
No. So let's assume that happens. The Tories have to think about not just who is going to be popular with their members. They need to be thinking about who is going to be able to pull back a lot of support for the Tory party. So they are going to have to factor in, who is popular with the public at large, not just who's popular with Tory members. And it feels as though Kemi doesn't score as well on that. She has to be popular with the members in order to get elected in the first place. That's unless the Tories change the rules, and there is talk of that happening. There are rumours within the sort of Tory circles that they may try to select the next leader purely on MPs' votes.
Oh,
which
my
would
goodness. The grassroots will be in uproar.
Well, yeah, it would be a very stupid thing to do, because if they isolate their membership, then they'll just go to reform, won't they? Or at least that's the danger. But they do then also need to think, well, who is going to have the broad appeal to the country? And I think the other thing you were saying that maybe the Penny thing is just because people remember her from the coronation. I think that plays into the whole point about personality politics, and that we are increasingly living in a sort of almost not a presidential type political system, but certainly people make choices based on who they recognise, who they think they know, not necessarily what their policies are. That's why we see people like Farage doing really well.
We're so shallow.
Yeah, we are, and it's why Boris did so well. And it's why why the Tories are still sort of clinging on to this idea that Starmer hasn't sealed the deal with the public, because Starmer isn't somebody who has that you can go down the pub and have a pint with him factor. And the public, I don't think we've seen it in those leadership debates, haven't we? The audiences aren't sort of cheering him, and it's not like Tony Blair walking on and being a rock star. They're sort of.
He's not a rock star, is he?
No, he's like
he wouldn't go on Splash.
No, he's like a maths teacher, sort of explaining a really hard problem to people, and
professorial.
So I think I do think that's important. That that Kemi, she's going to have to, and I think she is doing this because she's doing a lot of interviews. She is going to have better visibility, because an awful lot of people, if you went out there, they wouldn't know who she was.
Well, Mick Brown joins us in the Daily Tea studio. We were just discussing, Mick, what your job title is, and you don't seem to know, because you've been at the Telegraph for so long, turning in such great interviews that you're basically, we just call him Mick Brown. That's all we say.
I did suggest that we just called him all-round legend, but Mick seemed to be objecting to that.
From that.
No, come on now.
No, please.
But you've done this fabulous profile of Kemi Badenoch, which I presume was commissioned because we think that she may be a serious contender for leadership.
That's right. It was commissioned a little while ago, so it's been sort of ripening on the twig, I think, is the phrase. Yeah.
And you went around, presumably, and spoke to her nearest and dearest.
I spoke to people who'd worked with her, people who knew her well, people who were very much in favour of her, people who were less in favour of her. And the picture I got, I think, was a very mixed picture, a very mixed portrait of who Kemi Badenoch actually is. And if one's to strike a balance, I think the words that came out were combative, likes a fight, very capable in some respects, but not in others. A lot of people talking about how combative she's been, particularly on gender issues and race issues, which is something that struck me very much following her career. Less favourable in terms of her political accomplishments in trade and as a minister. I think one of the things that certainly struck me, and has struck me for a long time, is what an effective, fluent, and a combative, one might say, speaker. Funnily enough, I first encountered Kemi Badenoch in 2010. When she was standing as a Conservative candidate in the general election as the candidate for Dulwich, West Dulwich, I should say. And I just happened that there was a sort of round table of all the candidates in a room above my local pub. And I went along to listen to that, and I came away thinking, wow, this young woman's really got something. She was a very impressive speaker, very impressive talker, and clearly impressed the audience. Of course, at that point, I had no idea of quite how far her career would go. But the other word that keeps coming up in conversations with people is ambitious.
Yes.
And I think we have to be very careful with that word, because if it's applied to women, it's sometimes applied as sort of criticism. You wouldn't criticise a male politician as being ambitious. In fact, you'd just expect that it comes with the territory.
Yeah.
But clearly she has been very ambitious from the get-go.
Why is there this kind of Badenoch ... but? Because I've found this. I speak to people and they're like, oh, she's really great, but.
Well, firstly, I think anybody who is in, say, the Penny Mordaunt camp or another leadership camp, they will always come up with sort of little vignettes that they try and use to persuade you that they're actually no good, especially with women. We were talking about this earlier, weren't we? They tend to sort of say, oh, they're not very bright, or that there's not really anything behind that, which is obviously unfair. I think the thing I find interesting about her, when I sometimes talk to pollsters and people who do focus groups, and they have obviously focus grouped her a lot. And the thing that they criticise her for, i.e. the pollsters who spend their whole time watching politicians, is that they say she's an angry campaigner. She always seems to be cross about something, and that's her whole sort of persona, that she's very, just angry. And the difference between her and someone like Farage or Boris Johnson is that Farage and Boris are happy campaigners. They sort of do it all with a smile on their face. They look as if they're enjoying themselves, and people respond to that. And people don't respond so well necessarily to somebody who's always seems to be negative.
Always cross.
Yeah, she needs to, I think if she does want to go far, then she needs to think about that and, just not lighten up, but you know what I mean, just seem like she's actually enjoying being a politician rather than just being perpetually angry.
I think she does need to lighten up. I think she has got a sense of humour. She said something funny to me in an interview once. So people are talking about me being installed into Downing Street like I'm a set of double glazing. And I thought that's actually really quite funny.
Yeah, that's
but
a good joke.
She could be quite schoolmarmish. And I mean, people have asked me, funny enough, about her image. And I hate all this because, again, Gordon, it plays into the whole rhetoric around why are female politicians treated differently to men. But I'm sorry, presentation seems to matter more, and comparisons are therefore made with Penny Mordaunt. And she's got these very studious spectacles on, which I think she's wearing probably because she's short or long-sighted, but also to look clever. I noted that when we photographed her in the Sunday Telegraph, she had taken them off. She needs to soften a bit. Everything's very angry. You've used the word repeatedly, Mick, that kept on coming up, combative. Is there a bit of arrogance there as well? I remember meeting her for the first time and I didn't know who she was. This was ages ago. And she was really quite affronted by the idea that a journalist didn't know who Kemi Badenoch was, Mick.
Well, certainly she's not emollient. And that's came across very, very clearly from people that I spoke to. The other thing that came across, particularly talking to people who had known her, worked alongside her in the London Assembly, so before she was actually in Parliament at all, was that she's not what you might call a group player. She was somebody who kept very much to herself, who didn't cross the floor and engage in friendships with people on the other side of the House, if the London Assembly can be described as a house. Somebody who kept herself to herself, and who very much had her eye on the main prize. And so I got this impression very, very much. Also, I think she's extraordinarily serious-minded person. Looking for some sort of hinterland, I was asking you about what books she would have been interested in. And the only things I could come up with were Thomas Sowell, who is this rather extraordinary man, in my opinion, economist and philosopher who was very influential in Reagan-era time America, and Friedrich Hayek, who is not an easy read, I wouldn't have thought.
No, this isn't chick lit, Meg, is it? No.
So I think she's maybe it's her earnestness, her serious-minded. The other name, of course, that kept coming up was people were reminded of Margaret Thatcher. And 2 or 3 people said that, how much they reminded her of Thatcher. So again, there is that sort of determination, that single-minded focus, that I don't want to say gravitas particularly, but certainly that earnestness, and perhaps that lack of humour and that lack of the common touch, you might say.
I think also it's important to just make the point that we're talking about somebody who would be a leader of the opposition, assuming the Tories don't come third, as they nearly did in our poll. And so a lot of the criticisms of her about things like what Mick was saying about her perhaps not having a huge effect in her department, and some of the stuff around her maybe not being sort of cheery enough, a lot of that falls away because really her job would just be to hold Labour to account. She's very sharp-elbowed. We know that she's got very firm opinions, and I think in opposition she would, certainly if that was her job to begin with, she would perform well.
Mick, and also her background. Let's just address this because she's constantly accused, because she's a black woman on the right, of being an Uncle Tom and a coconut. I mean, to be fair to her and to be fair to the Conservative Party, if they did elect a black woman as leader, I mean, that would be a fantastic thing for progressive politics.
I completely agree with you, and I think that's something that infuriates her, those sort of accusations. So Tony Sawley, who's the man who headed the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, he was vehemently criticised after the publication of that report and called all sorts of things. I mean, he was accused of being an Uncle Tom and a coconut, these sort of racial pejoratives that are very often employed by people. The Labour MP Clive Lewis actually tweeted an image of the Ku Klux Klan, this with 9 of the 10 Commission members being black or ethnic minority. And Kemi Badenoch hit back against those critics, and she said it's even more irresponsible, dangerously so, to call ethnic minority people racial slurs like Uncle Toms, coconuts, house slaves, or house Negroes for daring to think differently.
But you've got to be really tough. You've got
to be tough to withstand that.
Is she thin-skinned or tough-skinned?
That's a really interesting question. I think she's probably pretty tough-skinned. And talking to Lord Saul, who knows her very well, I asked him a similar sort of question, and he said he doesn't know whether she goes home and cries at night, but he doesn't think she does. You know, I think she's pretty resilient. I think she's pretty tough. She's certainly tough-minded, and I'm not. I can't pretend to know anything about her personal life, but what people say is she has a very strong marriage. She's married to a man named Hamish Badenoch, who's a banker and who had political ambitions for himself. As Peter Lord Lilly put it, Hamish Badenoch said to him, well, there's only room for one politician in the family, and that's got to be Kemi. But I think her family life is supposed to be very supportive and very nurturing. So I think I would agree with Lord Saul from what I understand of her. She's not someone that goes home and cries at night. And she's probably someone who goes home, has a lovely family dinner, and then goes off and reads Friedrich Hayek.